In fact, you can go back and all the content from past semesters is there as well. So if you want to see a lecture, I can't imagine you do, but maybe some people do. If you want to see a lecture ahead of time, you can go back and look at the lectures from previous semesters. They're always a little bit different, but that's just, the content's the same. Sometimes I stress one thing over another. But the important stuff is always the same. All right. The textbooks to this class are actually quite expensive. And A&P textbooks are expensive, so I'm trying to make the class paperless by giving you older digital editions of the book that I have. All of those are already in the Moodle. Most of I would say maybe about 60% of the graphics that I use come out of this textbook. You also have the text of this. It's a very condensed conceptual outline of a lot of the topics that we're going to cover. It's pretty good. It's going to go beyond what we're able to cover here. And then this is also a really nice resource, far more than we can cover in a month in there. But now you have it, and if you're going to go on, those are all three of those, particularly these two, will be really good resources for you. And in lab, I've given you these three. This guy, Frank Netter, was the one that had that physiology atlas in the last slide. He is, if anybody's interested in anatomical art, he is sort of the great late 20th century, late 20th century anatomist, illustrator. So this is a really nice book. That's the one I learned out of. This one is excellent. This Gilroy, very, very detailed, excellent drawings. So you have both of those now. And then this is a kind of the most useful field guide you're ever going to find. The drawings are not as detailed, but it's exhaustive and it's concise and whatever. So you have that digitally, all three of those. Excellent resources, really. All of those are very good. So then these texts are in the library if you wish to purchase them. I didn't get one for everybody, but there are a dozen there for whoever might want to buy them. This is the newest edition of the Martini physiology text. I haven't actually even looked at it yet. They haven't sent me the review copy, but I do not imagine that it's going to deviate very drastically from the whatever 9th edition that you have digitally. But if you want a hard copy, it's there. And this is the lab manual. I have some older edition hard copies in the lab. I actually studied with that guy. I worked with that guy. We were in the same department in Texas. So I have some of older editions of that, but if you want a hard copy, you can. And then I ordered some of these. Out of any of these, if you're going to buy anything, I suggest buying that. It's the same small reference guide that I gave you in a digital version earlier, but this is a handheld copy that's quite useful if you're going on. You're unlikely to really need it here in this class, but if you're planning to go to maybe medical school or nursing school or PT or whatever, those are pretty useful resources. So, okay. My expectations. So, how many in here are considering, just by a rough show of hands, considering a career in the health sciences? All right, most of the class. Well, that's a professional career, right, in the health sciences. And I expect professionalism. Now, that obviously doesn't mean that I, am not going to drink tea in front of you. That's not what I mean by professional. What I mean by professionalism is giving studied responses when you're called upon, giving your all is what I want. And really being ethical in the conduct of the class. So I gave you all these digital resources to use. Don't post them, don't share them. They're for your use here in the class. And I really, I'm here to be your biggest supporter and really have your best interest at heart, but I'm giving it my all, and I expect the same from you. I really, we have a unique opportunity here in Jan Plan where I am the only class you're taking. I imagine some of you are athletes, so I'm not the only thing you need to balance, but much more so than a standard semester. You really have a chance to immerse yourself in this class, and that's what I want. I want you to give it as much as I am. So, yeah, critical thinking, a lot of, if you're gonna go to medical school or nursing school or wherever, they are going to make you memorize an immense amount of material, huge amounts of data, right? You need to, that's important. I'm gonna do some of that with you, not exhaustive. I think a more important thing for you to establish now is the ability to think critically, to look at something and say, do I believe that? What do I think? What if I think about it this way? Okay, well then let's think the contrary way. Challenge your convictions. Argue against your convictions. Think critically. Think critically. Because that is what will set you apart from being an average healthcare practitioner and being the exceptional healthcare practitioner that we need in this country, that your patients deserve. Thinking critically. It'll set you apart. It'll help you catch those 3% of cases that would slip by everybody else, where you may save somebody's life, where you may change somebody's life, and someone else wouldn't have because they were not thinking critically from the beginning. Right? Think critically, not just in this class, but in your entire life. In your entire life, like as I said in the beginning, this class is a metaphor. I'm seeing this class as a metaphor for everything else in your life. Okay. And then written and verbal communication skills. Those, as a Goldie student, you're probably sick of hearing that, but it is so essential how well you can communicate, both verbally and in a written format. Don't assume that you got it down. You don't. Everybody, including myself, always has room for growth. Always. Constantly be working on your communication skills. All right. So my concept of success. What do I think success is in this class? Success is, yes, giving me your best performance. Doing as good a job on the assignments, on the quizzes, on the tests, on the projects. Given a baseline of this, I want you to establish and maintain a healthy, balanced lifestyle. That means I would like you to get a reasonable amount of sleep every night. Is that 7 hours? Is it 8 hours? Is it 9? Whatever. Somewhere in there, in that range. Get that amount of sleep every night. It does not serve you to stay up past your bedtime because your brain just is not going to work properly. Your health is going to go down. It's just not worth it. It's not the life that you, as intelligent individuals that have been given the privilege of all these resources, should be living. Find a healthy, balanced lifestyle that you can set for the rest of your life. Right? What's the point of our society now, where we have our best and brightest out there living lives that are marginally worth living, where they are stressed out, where they are not as productive, where their potential is being wasted? Don't do that to yourselves. Societally, we can break that cycle right here. So 8 hours of sleep a night. regular, balanced, nutritionally appropriate meals, particularly for those of you who are athletes, you may need to eat more than 3 meals a day, okay? And be conscious of what you're eating. Eat a reasonable amount of protein, eat the right kinds of fats, limit refined sugars, eat plenty of vegetables. I mean, it's pretty simple stuff, right? Get regular physical activity because that is going to help you in the other realms of your life, right? It's going to help reduce your stress. It's going to help focus your mind when you are dedicated to studying. Keep your stress, strive to keep your stress at 3 or below on a scale of 1 to 5. You'll notice that's on that lifestyle log there. All right, the schedule. This is subject to a little bit of change if I need to, but here it is, just so that you can understand it. Has anybody not seen this yet? Most of you haven't or haven't. It's all up on the Moodle. So lecture and lab are going to switch which one is first, okay, throughout the weeks. This first week, lecture will be first. I try to give the lab over structures, over the anatomy, before coming to the lecture. To talk about the physiology. And there will be quizzes, here, quiz 1, 2, 3, quiz 4, over the lecture material previous to that quiz throughout the semester. I did that at students' request in the past semester, and it does seem to help reinforce things for you. Don't be too intimidated by it. For the labs, there are pre-lab podcasts that I have made that in the past I used to do the lecture in the lab, but then they didn't have much time to actually do the labs. And so that you have more hands-on time, I'm going to do a very brief introduction in the labs and then give you more hands-on time with the materials. And because of that, there will be pre-labs that you can watch. They're short videos that go over the material with slides. There's a number of field trips, not as many as I've done in years past, because for a number of reasons outside of my control, but there's a few. We're still going to go to the art museum at the end of this week, and we're going to do this metabolic lab, and we're also going to get to go to Maine General Augusta to give some presentations at the end of the semester. It's a pretty cool thing that we get to do in conjunction with the University of New England medical students there, and talk about that more later. One of this lecture here, in the years past, I haven't had any endocrine physiology. That was an activity with some other high school students that I wasn't able to organize this year. So instead, I'm going to give you some endocrinology. Endocrinology is interesting. All right, here's the grading scheme. So I'm presenting this as hard percentages for what each of these are worth. And I'm going to, maybe I shouldn't admit it. I've never really admitted it in the past, but I'm going to admit it. These are a little bit subjective. I told you what I thought success was. Success was doing the best you can do and maintaining a healthy lifestyle, right? That's really subjective, okay? What I want to see is you doing your level best. Doing your level best. In the past, these lab practicals, students, my first semester, their average was like 41 or something like that, 36, I don't know, it's really low. And I've gotten better at making sure to drive into the students the right ways to study that material, and it's gone up a little bit, but it's still pretty low. Don't be shocked if you get hit pretty hard in the beginning. That's okay. I make this class with almost an unreasonable amount of material because I want to see it as open-ended. I want to see how far students can push themselves, take apart their lifestyle, figure out different ways of studying, managing an almost unmanageable amount of data, and then seeing what happens. Okay, so like I'm saying there's a bit of a curve, and I don't know what that curve is until I see the semester and get to know you as students. All right, but this is roughly how I value each of the things in this class. A big chunk of the class, a quarter of it, is these grand rounds presentations. These are talks. You can read about it in the syllabus. These are talks on different topics related to health. So continuing medical education is a big part of the medical profession. And grand rounds is the biggest way that at least physicians do that. Somebody has an interesting case, those doctors get in front of the medical community wherever they are, and they present that case, and then it gets discussed. And so we're going to do a similar thing here in this class. It's been really fun in the past. It's always fun. There's a number of different ways that you can select a topic. You can read about it in the syllabus. The one that I think is perhaps the easiest is to go to this New England Journal of Medicine database of the main general hospital clinico-pathologic conferences that are all posted right there. You can read about them. The cool thing about those is I've become chummy with the lady that handles the database down there, and she emails me the PowerPoints from the original physicians' presentations when those cases were given down there at Maine General. So that's a pretty big leg up for those students. Now, what has made these grand rounds interesting is actually not just those talks, but also the ones where the students want to do something totally different. They were interested in this medical topic, and they researched it on their own, and they gave the whole day of presentations a variety. So don't feel, restricted to doing that, but take a look at it for sure. There's a lot of cool things in there. It might help stimulate your creativity. All right, we'll just keep going. Yeah, I think I've already kind of covered this, but I don't know. This is a slide I use sometimes. So these are some personal traits: calmness, poise. So, for example, you are a physician and you are in an emergency room, and somebody is bleeding out, and there is a family freaking out in the room. There are nurses that are bumping into themselves, not knowing what to do because they've lost their composure. You are the person that needs to maintain an ego boundary, meaning you can see the emotions that everybody else has, but you decide what your emotional response is going to be. You remain calm and poised so that you can make the right sorts of decisions in a timely fashion, so that you can be the level head in the room. It's really important. Do not panic. Be organized mentally, emotionally, physically. Be organized with your time. Preparedness. So I think I probably circle that one. Yeah. Preparedness. That is so key. You will get the most out of this class and the rest of your life if you're coming to class having already looked at what I'm talking about. In any class, that's true. If you can look ahead, if you can prepare ahead, bring notes to class, not notes away from class, notes to class, then you are going to be far ahead of the game. It's going to be much easier for you to make the sorts of lifestyle changes that I'm talking about. It's juice per squeeze. How are you going to get the most out of your time? Study a little bit before coming to class, and then it makes class time more productive, and you need to put less time after class. Enthusiastic. Be excited about the material, even if you're not. Just lie to yourself if that's what it takes. It doesn't matter. Be enthusiastic, because if you're excited about what you're doing, it's so much easier. It's so much easier, right? And frankly, I see very little reason to not be excited. What an honor, what a privilege we have to be here together, learning about the human body. It's hard for me to come up with another topic that is as awe-inspiring, but at the same time as personal as what we're here studying, right? It's the very stuff that our own existence is made of, and it has boundless mysteries that have been unraveled and many that have not. Right? So it's exciting. It's exciting. I love it, and I hope you'll join me in that enthusiasm. All right. And then discipline. This discipline is where it's at. Just it's a lifetime of learning discipline, of learning how to be organized with your time, organized with your mind. Discipline. All right. So here's a couple quick things. I'm going over this slower than I intended, but develop a reference system that works for you. I have a couple suggestions there. I like a 2-notebook system for A&P at least, where, and in another slide I'll talk a little bit more about some successful ways of taking notes over this material, where you have one set of notes that's over the content stream. And that's basically a outline of the material as I'm covering it in the class. And then there's another set of notes, if you want to call them that. It's essentially a list of things that you are struggling with, a list of concepts that you don't really understand. And you keep that list next to your notes as you're going through the notes, as you're going, maybe in lecture, as you're reviewing the notes. So at the beginning, when you're making notes before class, in class, after class, you have this list of concepts you don't understand. So that, and be honest with yourself about it. What concepts are you actually struggling with? So that when you're going to review, you can focus your energies on those things. People like to feel good about themselves, so students tend to have a overemphasis on concepts they already have, stuff that's already in their minds that makes them feel better. Oh, yeah, let's make sure I got that. But you have it. So be honest with yourself. What don't you have? Go to that. Work on that stuff. It's going to be a much more efficient use of your time. Yeah. All right. Every study session. I believe this. So I like breaking every study session up into 3 parts. Say you have an hour. Say you have 2 hours. Say you have 3 hours. Whatever it is, break it up into roughly 3 equal parts. A third of the time, you're going over the material that you just talked about in class. Synthesizing everything that we just covered that day. Another third of the time is going over everything thus far. All right, everything thus far, because a lot of these concepts are cumulative. This is where that second list of concepts comes into play. So you're going back and making sure to check off things off that list, ideas that you didn't solidify. You're spending a third of the time, every time, doing that. All right? And then a third of the time, you're outlining material for the next class. So that you come into class with a rough set of notes that you can then amend when you're in class. That you can say, oh, he didn't talk about that, scratch that out, or he made this point that I didn't pick up out of the slides, so I'm gonna jot that down. But you're not spending all your time taking notes. You're doing this. You're listening to me and absorbing, and still taking some notes, right? Okay. So this is a method of note-taking. Maybe some of you, probably many of you, are familiar with the Cornell method. So in my 3-part study session model, you would take notes in this portion of your page, over the notes, over the appropriate readings in the book. For the first 2/3 of the semester, there's a sheet in the Moodle that gives you some suggested readings that correspond to my lecture stuff. I don't do it for the whole semester, but gives you a chance, if you want to look in a more guided way at the text, you can outline that, or you can go straight off my slides. Every single slide for the whole semester is already posted. So you do that, you bring this to class, and then in class you can amend this and then write cues down here, like, you know, and whatever this cue might be. So, for example, it's talking about spiders, and then you're clarifying what that meant there, or maybe it's referencing some other concept somewhere else, or maybe a question that you may have, like, Star, don't understand this, or question, ask Dr. K what the difference between pseudostratified epithelium and stratified epithelium is, something like that. And then after class, you go home, you look this over as you're looking it over, and you just kind of summarize what the main ideas were there to yourself. Okay, so that's one way of taking notes. I'm not saying you have to do that, but that's a way that works for people. All right, almost there. So here's the lifestyle log. It's pretty easy. Did you get 6 hours sleep last night, 8, what have you? Weightlifting, 30 minutes. Elliptical, 45 minutes, whatever. Stress, my stress today is at 4 because it's the first day of class, whatever. And then yogurt, granola, apple and nuts, or sandwich, or whatever. Dinner, pâté foie gras, and there you have it. So I don't know, I know a few of you know that I also teach yoga on Wednesdays at noon, or at least I used to. Not enough people have been coming to my noon class. Yeah, so this semester I'm going to be trying to do yoga in the athletic center at 1:30 or so, somewhere around there. I'm going to go and hopefully 4 days a week do yoga after class for anybody in the class that wants to join in there with me. I'm basically just doing it myself too. I teach a style of yoga called Ashtanga. The point of Ashtanga is to encourage self-practice. It's the same sequence every time. So if you actually do come to my class, I will make a lot of anatomical correlations with the yoga for you, which may be interesting. But by the end of the semester, hopefully you will have learned the sequence so you can do it on your own at home without having to go to classes ever. So that's an opportunity for you as well, if you want to join me. Patabi Joyce was the modern forefather of this type of yoga. He's now gone. All right, let's get to some actual stuff. Did anyone have any questions before I move on? Is that pretty clear? Enthusiastic, a little unsure? Get me out of here. All right. How finely crafted this ship of fools, sail and beam, fleeting flesh and bone. All right. So one of my themes is that you guys are part of a continuum that goes throughout human history. People striving to understand the workings of the human body, ways of dealing with disease, go back to the earliest times. Some of the earliest writings we can find relate to this, to human health. Here is an example. Here is a copy, or here is the copy of the Edwin Smith Papyrus. It is widely believed to be the oldest medical text. It was ancient Egyptian. This is almost 4,000 years old. So quite ancient. And some of the procedures that were described, certainly not all, but some of the procedures are, in rough terms, still practiced today for trauma to the body. So even this long ago, some fairly sophisticated understanding of the human body and disease. Um, maybe I'll go a little faster through some of this history than I would like to. But here's Hippocrates. I will give Hippocrates his due, since all physicians in the United States take the Hippocratic Oath. He established a code of ethics governing what he saw to be the right way to practice medicine. He asked physicians to seek natural causes of disease rather than attributing them to the capriciousness of angry gods. You have this lump growing on you because it's cancer, not because you pissed off Zeus. And this was a major step forward, actually, in sort of eliminating the voodoo from the study of the human body and beginning to look for concrete, empirical evidence in the treatment of disease. All right, our man Aristotle. He continued in this vein by thinking, this was a long-fought battle, this overcoming notions of the supernatural. And so the way he dealt with it was by using language, developing language, which is how we come to understand the world. And he said, teleologi were supernatural causes for disease, things that cannot be explained outside of gods and demons. However, natural causes are physiologi. So he codified the ideas of Hippocrates. You're welcome to take these notes over this stuff, but I'm just going to tell you, I'm never going to test you on any of the history. It's just not going to be part of the test. You write it down if you want. And he began to really look at anatomy and try to understand the physical composure of the human form. He was particularly interested in the heart. I mean, it's an interesting organ. It's this constantly moving organ in the center of your being. And he believed that the nerves radiated from the heart. That was an anatomical mistake that took several centuries to undo. All right. Galen. There's a lot of text on this. We could have probably at least a lecture devoted to this guy. He is the Roman that students love to hate. He was pretty incredible guy, though. He was the physician to the Roman gladiators. Because of that, he got to see a lot of pretty serious anatomy. Some very buff individuals getting hacked to bits. That was a really fertile source for his investigations of the human body. Particularly so because in Rome, in the 2nd century Rome, dissections of the human body were forbidden. They were not allowed to do human dissections. So the fact that he was able to see these gladiators getting hacked open and whatever gave him a window that other people of his time did not have. He also supplemented that with some animal dissection studies that would not fly in modern times with PETA, but did give some real insights into the fundamentals of physiology at the time. So he was one of the first people that really began to see science as a method, not just a textbook full of knowledge. Science isn't just a collection of facts. It is a method whereby you discover the workings of a natural system. All right. So it's a method of gaining knowledge. So the last 3 slides, we're going from Hippocrates and Aristotle, and now to Galen, from the Greeks to the Romans. This whole process of dispelling myth and the gods, and coming up with a process for understanding how things actually work using critical thinking. He didn't like Aristotle. He disparaged those who know nothing of what it is to be seen in dissection. I have shown in my book on the teachings of Hippocrates and Plato that the source of the nerves of all sensation and of voluntary motion is the encephalon, or brain, and that the source of the arteries and of the innate heat is the heart. Not really a humble guy, not one to mince words, but what do you say when you're good? Okay, not to let the people in the North Mediterranean have all the fun. So the Jewish and Muslim cultures were also instrumental in furthering our understanding of the human body. This guy, Avicenna Ibn Sina, called the Galen of Islam. When I was putting together the endocrinology slideshow this weekend, he came up again when I was putting the history slides in the beginning of that one, because Graves' disease, or hypothyroidism, is a disease often attributed to Robert Graves from the mid-19th century. But actually, it was this guy that first identified it in the 10th century. So, yeah, he's a pretty amazing physician, as was this Moses Maimonides. So, unfortunately, we're not going to get a chance to go into their contributions. Vesalius, by this time in Italy, so he was Flemish, but he worked in Italy at the time. Dissection became accepted and the norm, and he was the first great modern anatomist, and did these really stunning dissections and drawings of these dissections. I don't want to spend too much more time on all these guys. Hooke was instrumental in driving the understanding that there is this size continuum in the human body, that organs are made up of tissues, and tissues are made up of cells. He was the first to really use microscopes for the study of biological samples. This is a drawing that he made of cork, the first cellular tissue. Just described in detail. All right. This is the last guy I'm going to talk about. And I wish there were more women. There are all these dudes. But this guy really did add something, I believe. He was an architect. This is what sets him apart. Although he was a devotee of Darwin. So Charles Darwin, when he published On the Origin of the Species, totally radically affected the intellectual world, the world of thinkers in all disciplines. And this guy was one example. So he is in this book, The Tall Office Building Artistically Considered. Here's the first skyscraper ever built by this guy, or by anybody, this first skyscraper. In this book of his, it says, "Is the pervading law of all things organic and inorganic, of all things physical and metaphysical, of all things human and all things superhuman, of all true manifestations of the head, of the heart, of the soul, that the life is recognizable in its expression. That," and here's the important bit, "that form ever follows function." This is the law. So this is the idea, and he applied this to architecture, but the idea that the structure of something, of an organ, of a tissue, of a cell, of anatomy, gross anatomy, is subject to the function that that structure must perform. All right? And there's this structure-function relationship that goes from, and you know, it's like the base of understanding gross anatomy and biomechanics, all the way down to understanding biochemistry and how the structure of proteins dictates the function, or the function that it needs to perform is dictated by that. Okay, so anatomy. What is anatomy and physiology? Anatomy is simply the structures of the body. What are they made of? Where are they located? And importantly, what are the salient relationships? So the anatomical relationships. You know, in here, like in the lab, I'm going to have you say, point A, tell me what this thing is, or point B, tell me what that thing is. And most of the time, it's going to be fairly obvious what I'm asking. Hopefully, this is the liver, what have you. But maybe you don't know. Maybe I'm pointing to some big blob, what looks like a blob to you, and you have to say to yourself, well, what could it be? What could it be? It could be a spleen, could be the liver. What do I know? Well, it's on the right side of the body. The liver's on the right side. Must be the liver. Okay. It's oftentimes you cannot identify something unless you know its relationship to what surrounds it. When you go to medical school or wherever you're going, they're gonna show you the base of the skull. We're gonna look in the lab a little bit at this in very, very surface, not in detail. But there's a million little holes, million little spicules of bone, and they say, what is this tiny little spicule of bone, which is surrounded by 30 others? And the only way you're really going to be able to know is by saying, it's next to this hole, which is next to that mound, which is next to this fossa, and I know what that fossa is. And so you just work your way back based upon those anatomical relationships. No piece of anatomy exists in isolation. So there's both gross anatomy, that doesn't mean disgusting, that means large, visible with the eye, and then microscopic anatomy, hooks, cells, all right? And then there's physiology, and that's how this is the structure, this is the function, that structure-function relationship. So how do these anatomical structures work? What are they doing? They have unique individual functions, and sometimes there are cooperative functions working in concert with other parts of your anatomy. This includes both chemistry, biochemistry, genetics, biology. All right, so this is a pretty fundamental concept to the study of A&P. There is this hierarchical level of organization where you are made up, as Carl Sagan would say, out of the stuff of stars, right? All of the atoms in our body were initially the gases that formed stars, right? So all of this is made of atoms. These form molecules. Molecules associate and form macromolecules like DNA, proteins, lipids, polysaccharides. These macromolecules form in varied combinations to form organelles. Organelles are the building blocks of cells, which themselves are the building blocks of tissues. Tissues form organs. Organs then form organ systems. Your nervous system, your circulatory system, your respiratory system, your endocrine system. And then organ systems come together in concert to form beautiful babies that are as big as the earth, bigger than whatever that is there. Okay, so here's that same size continuum, so you can get a sense of the real scale, down from 0.1 nanometers all the way up, which is 10 to the negative 10th meters, all the way up to meter scale. And these are the ways we have of probing these structures. So the transmission electron microscope, a TEM, or a SEM, they get down pretty low, down to the size of macromolecules for the TEM and some of the SEM. And then a really nice compound light microscope maybe can visualize a particularly large viral capsid. And then smaller than about a millimeter or so is not visible with the human eye. All right. So here's the same continuum, this time breaking it up into each of the organ systems. So I'm going to assume that you guys have a basic understanding of what atoms are, what chemical bonds are, how chemical bonds form molecules, and that sort of thing. I'm not going to go through any of the chemistry or biochemistry, although I'd love to, because that's actually what I was trained in. But instead, we are going to focus a little bit on types of cells in the lab, and we're going to explore each of these organ systems and go down from each of these organ systems to look at the organs. All right, we're going to go one at a time through most of those organ systems. We won't get a chance to talk about the reproductive system or the lymphatic system. We may or may not talk about the endocrine system. That's on Martin Luther King Day, and I'm not going to. I want to let you out a little early that day. Okay, so first, let's going to briefly hit them now. The integumentary system. The integument is the outer covering of the body. This includes skin, hair, sweat glands, and nails, your fingernails. Not only does it serve to protect you against environmental hazards, it's also regulating your body temperature and giving you sensory information about creepy crawly things or whatever is climbing on you. Your hand is on a stove. The skeletal system, primarily composed of bones with the connective tissue, cartilage, ligaments, and then there is the bone marrow. It's the soft part in the center of the long bones and a little bit in some of the flat bones. Of course, it provides support and protection for the body. It's also a massive buffer for the calcium in your body. It's the calcium repository. And the bone marrow, the red marrow, is the site of erythropoiesis, the formation of red blood cells. The muscular system. There are three types of muscle cells. There is skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Only skeletal muscle is part of the muscular system. Okay? Cardiac muscle is the heart, that's part of the circulatory system, and smooth muscle finds itself all over the place. This is non-voluntary muscle that you're not able to consciously control. But the muscular system, as so-called, is made up of the skeletal muscles and the connective tissue that attaches them to the bones, which are the tendons. They, of course, help move the body by pulling on the rigid framework of the skeletal system. They also are protecting other structures in the body. For example, Harry Houdini He died. Does anybody know how Harry Houdini died? He was punched in the stomach. He famously had this bet out there that anybody, he could take a sock to the stomach from anybody. And he did. He got punched in the stomach by lots of people. He was fine. However, he was backstage at the Majestic Theater in Detroit. I know that because I used to work there. And some guy tapped him on the shoulder in the dressing room. He turned around. Bam! He wasn't ready. Got socked in the stomach. Ruptured his spleen, maybe? And died at Henry Ford Hospital. So it was always his muscles that were protecting the organs. When they were not contracted, it led to his injury and death. Okay, and then also muscles are a massive source of metabolic heat. All right. The nervous system. You can think of the body as a giant life support system for this weird gray squishy worm that is the nervous system, our brain and spinal cord. All right. So it's divided into the central and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system is the nerves and various sensory organs that radiate out from the brain and spinal cord. So it is one of the two major control systems in the body. It is the control system that dictates immediate response. Whoa, my doormate is throwing a snowball right at my head. I see it, and I duck, and it hits the guy behind me. That was your nervous system that did that. It coordinates, moderates activities of the other organ systems. It is sort of the conductor at the symphony in your body. Here is the other major control system in the body, the endocrine system. It is a suite of non-centralized organs throughout the body. The endocrine system is a chemical control system. The nervous system is electrical, right? It's sending electrical signals that we're going to learn about in excruciating detail in a couple lectures from now. The endocrine system uses chemicals released into the blood. It's directing long-term, slow, or at least slower changes in the body. It can adjust metabolic activity, energy use, and is the key player in development. That is the process of going from an embryo to a fetus, to a newborn, to a child, to an adolescent, to an adult, into senescence. Cardiovascular system. Basically, the heart, the blood, and the blood vessels. This is the system that is responsible for pumping blood around the body, which carries nutrients and waste and hormones and the immune system and all the other things. Basically, the highway of the body. Helps transport oxygen and carbon dioxide as well. It distributes heat and assists in the control of body temperatures. Are you running a marathon? Well, you're flush and you're radiating heat. Your circulatory system has directed blood to the periphery, or are you stuck in the cold out in the snow someplace? And the periphery, we sequester blood to the core, and the periphery gets colder. The lymphatic system. Unfortunately, we won't get to study this at all, but it's a really fascinating system. Its major organ is the spleen, the thymus in infants, And then the lymphatic vessels, nodes, of which the most famous are the tonsils and the adenoids. It is can rightly be thought of as a parallel circulatory system, another system of tubes that runs throughout the system parallel to the cardiovascular system. But it doesn't have a pump. It doesn't have a pump of its own. In fact, these lymph nodes are, so just looking at this sort of rough diagram here, or what you know from your own experience, where are most lymph nodes located? Say it. There are many under your arm, exactly. Where else? Under your throat. Where else? What do those two places have in common? They're warm, sure. What do you think?
So anywhere near like orifices?
Near orifices, maybe, yeah. Yeah, I can see that.
Joints.
Okay, that's what I was fishing for. They're at points in the body, at joints, points in the body that move. Your body, when you move, you are squeezing on these lymph nodes. They're like rubber bulbs, sort of, that are squishing the lymph along its route. All right. So lymph nodes. This is why one of the reasons why people that are bedbound and immobile can have a harder time moving lymph through their body, because it needs bodily motion to help get the flow of lymph. So the lymphatic system, this is your white blood cells run through the lymphatic system, defends against infection, and there's a fluid balance between the bloodstream and the lymphatic system. So it's very close, in close juxtaposition to the circulatory system as well. All right. Say more, but we'll leave it there. Respiratory system, the nasal cavity, sinuses, larynx, trachea, bronchi, lungs, and then the alveoli in the lungs. So the primary job of the respiratory system is to bring oxygen into the blood and remove carbon dioxide as metabolic waste from the body, from the blood. A second, slightly less important function is phonation, the making of sounds. The digestive system. Another way to think of the human body is as a giant tube. We are a giant tube that runs from our mouth to our anus. The organs that you'll see along the way in that tube are your teeth, tongue, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine. And then these accessory organs, the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas, which are responsible for secreting various chemicals necessary in digestion. The function here is to process food, extract nutrients, maintaining water balance by absorbing and conserving water. And the liver is also important in storing energy reserves. This is where we form and store glycogen, the liver and in muscle cells. Urinary system, on the other hand, is the system we use to eliminate fluids and various water-soluble toxins from the body, waste products. So the major organ is the kidney, and then the downstream structures for water elimination, so for urine elimination, the ureters, bladder, and urethra. So excreting waste, controlling water balance, and regulating the pH of your blood by maintaining the ion balance in your body. Right? The kidneys also have a role in the endocrine system. In fact, many of these organs have crossover into the endocrine system as well. We'll talk about that more later. The male reproductive system, and this is all you're going to get on the repo system this semester. The major organs in the male are the testes, epididymis, the vas deferens, seminal vesicles, prostate, penis, and scrotum. So the purpose here is to produce the male germ cell lines, or sperm, and then the associated suspensory fluids of semen and the hormones that are necessary, the androgenic hormones that are necessary for there to be maleness. And then, of course, sexual intercourse. I am not minimizing so to speak, the male reproductive system at all. It's pretty incredible what it has managed to do. It takes a living motile cell and is able to expel it from the body in such a way that it is not just able to live, but has a purpose that it seeks out and performs, or else we wouldn't be here. It's a pretty remarkable service the male reproductive system performs, only challenged in its awe-inspiringness by the female reproductive system, which is made up of the ovaries, the uterine tubes, the uterus, vagina, maybe a clitoris, and the mammary glands. So the female reproductive system produces the germ cells for the female. These are the oocytes. This happens in the ovaries. And the associated androgenic hormones, estrogen. Beyond that, the female reproductive system receives the sperm and begins to nurture a fertilized egg where it becomes an embryo and then a fetus, another living human being inside of itself, where it gestates for 9 months before birth. And then, after birth, postpartum, the woman is able to produce milk through the mammary glands to nourish the infant. It is truly perhaps the most miraculous thing that humans or any organism is able to do. It's a shame that we won't be able to give it its due in this course. But, all right, on to what is probably the most fundamental concept of physiology. This is the idea of homeostasis. Homeostasis. This word was coined by Walter Cannon, this guy here who lived around the turn of the last century. Homeostasis is a process by which all of the organ systems in the body are working together to maintain a stable internal state, a stable internal environment is the word I use there. All right. So the physiological state of the body is constantly in flux. So, for example, your temperature is always going like this. All right. And homeostasis is the process whereby your temperature is going like this and not like this, or not like this. It's maintaining a stable value around some sort of set point. There are all kinds of feedback control mechanisms, negative feedback, positive feedback, that keeps whatever variable is being controlled by homeostasis close to this set point. If you lose homeostatic control over some variable, be it body temperature or there's a lot of them, we'll go through them all, you will become ill and potentially die, depending on what it is. So, here are the elements of a generalized homeostatic system. And this is in that, the Basic Principles book. There's a nice outline of this in there. There is, where should I start? There's some kind of regulated variable, all right? Let's just, whatever it happens to be, can be body temperature, because that's an easy one. And then there's some sort of sensory mechanism that we're using to sample this variable that is sending information to the integration center. That can be an endocrine tissue, it can be the brain, central nervous system. That integration system compares the sensed value to a set point, all right, and then it decides what to do, and it sends a signal to an effector, which is something that's going to change the variable, right, and then that affects this regulated variable. You can have negative feedback, which slows down the change in that variable, or you can have positive feedback, which speeds it up. There are certain types of positive feedback mechanisms in the body, like childbirth or what have you. We'll talk about those in a bit. And then there are these feed-forward controllers. These are external stimuli that can change the normal feedback response. So, for example, there's the integration center that in the brain, the brainstem, that is helping to control your heart rate. But you're on your first date or something with your sweetheart, and you're imagining that you are about to go and give them the first kiss on the cheek, and your heart begins to flutter thinking about it. That would be the feed-forward control as you anticipate an action. Okay, so it's giving external input into that system. All right. So these are a couple different types of mechanisms of regulation. There is this auto-regulation, or intrinsic. So there are certain cells or tissues that have this whole mechanism built right into them. They have it built right into them. The integration center is not far away in the brain. It's right in that tissue. There's some sort of variable stimulus is sensed by that cell. The cell integrates and responds by producing more or less of some chemical. All right, so this is intrinsic. So the cell in the tissue is got this small loop right there. All right, there are some examples of that. Then there's extrinsic, and that is where there's a cell or tissue or whatever that has a process that's being homeostatically controlled, and it's being sensed. Information is being sent to the nervous and endocrine system, which is processing that and affecting that. We have this response that involves an outside control, an outside regulating or integration center. Does that make sense? All right. So here is a basic schematic of negative feedback, and this is like classic analogy. We have the room temperature. It's July and it's hot out. The temperature in the house starts to go up. There's a thermometer in the thermostat here, and the thermometer tells the thermostat compares the value of the thermometer to the set point where we dial in the temperature in the house, and it says, okay, well, this value is too far out of range, so we're going to turn on the effector, the air conditioner. That's going to bring the temperature back down into the range. Temperature drops, we get back to normal. All right, and then once it's back to normal, it turns off the air conditioner. So if we look at the temperature in the room with time, we see a fluctuation. All right? So temperature rises, air conditioner's off, air conditioner turns on, cools it down till the bottom end of the range, shuts the AC off, temperature goes up again. Okay? So it's just sort of that. Same thing happens in the body. So we have body temperature, temperature sensors in the skin and hypothalamus, sensated by the brain. There's the thermoregulatory system in the brain, and then that turns on various effectors, your sweat glands, blood vessels begin to dilate in the periphery to radiate heat off, and brings you back to normal. And the temperature of your body oscillates in a manner similar to the way a house might. Okay. This happens in, here's another example. So the postural changes in blood pressure. When they get up from bed, blood drains from the upper body where it's been pooling, and the blood pressure drops. People get a little woozy, but the baroreceptors above the heart, in the aortic arch and the carotid bulb turn on. Baro just means pressure receptors, and they send a signal to the brain to speed up the heart. The brain sends a signal to the heart. Heart starts pumping a little bit faster to get that blood pressure up. Comes up and feel normal. Everything's cool. This is one of the reasons that old people, particularly old people with heart disease that have atherosclerosis, that they get dizzy when they get up out of bed, and they're like this. They can't keep it together because these baroreceptors, the arteries there become sclerotic or covered in plaque, and they're not as responsive to temperature changes. So there's a disconnect here in the system. So they're not able to sensate pressure changes as much, and the heart doesn't speed up. The thermoregulatory system doesn't kick on and increase the blood pressure enough. So that's why older people with those sorts of problems should get up slower. All right. Positive feedback. This is the other side of the coin. I've been talking about negative feedback so far, like keeping your body in a narrow range of normal. All right. Sometimes we need to get outside of normal. There are examples. One of them, I think, is hemostasis. So blood clotting. You get a cut. You bleed. These damaged cells release various chemicals, and that start this clotting cascade, which is an incredibly complicated set of factors that allow the blood to clot. And these chemicals start this positive feedback loop where the blood, once you get the ball rolling, the clotting really starts happening quickly around the site of injury. And then the blood clot plugs the break in the vessel wall, bleeding stops, and then that positive feedback slows down because we're not driving it as much with these additional chemicals that are being released. Some other examples are childbirth, contractions during childbirth. So when you have a contraction that makes it so that your body wants to have more contractions, so the more contractions you have, the more you're going to have, and it's a speeding up, a positive feedback thing. Protein digestion in the stomach is the same way. Fever is the same sort of positive feedback. Ovulation, lactation, the milk letdown. So when you begin to have milk let down, it stimulates you to have more and more. It ramps up. Okay. Yeah, here's an example of contraction. The pressure on the cervix from the head of the infant causes a contraction, which causes more pressure on the cervix, which causes more contraction. Positive feedback system. All right. So communication is essential for this. And I said there were two types of control systems. systems. What were they again? What were the two organ systems that control everything? Nervous system and the endocrine system, exactly. So the nervous system is the fast communication. This is electrical. We have a neuron that sends a nerve impulse to some sort of downstream effector. And then we have the endocrine system, which is a chemical signaling system, where you have some sort of endocrine tissue. This could be the pituitary, this could be the thyroid, it could be whatever. And it's going to release the chemicals into the bloodstream. They travel through the bloodstream to the target cell, and then which is affected by whatever that hormone is. Both of these are the total of extrinsic regulation in homeostasis. We also talk about intrinsic, right? The one where there's an auto-regulation of certain cells that regulate themselves within a tight loop. All extrinsic homeostasis is one of these two. The mode of communication is dictated by whether it's neural or endocrine is dictated by these three requirements. How far is it? Is it short? Well, then we're going to have some kind of paracrine communication where you have cells that are right next to each other. They don't need the circulatory system. This is called paracrine. Or autocrine. These are self-stimulating cells. This is the intrinsic. Form of regulation. Otherwise, we can have long distance, and that's somatic nerves or the endocrine system with the bloodstream. Speed. How fast do we need to affect a change? If it needs to be really fast, then we're going to use the nervous system. If it doesn't need to be fast, we're going to use the endocrine system, these chemical distribution signals in the blood. And then the distribution of the effect is the response need to be something very targeted, like a single muscle somewhere, or is it something that needs to happen throughout the entire body? So, for example, if it was focused, we would use the nervous system. However, if it was like the fight or flight response and we needed epinephrine, then it would be the endocrine system where the entire body is being turned on. Okay, so I'm not going to go through this whole table. This text is too tiny, but you can look back at this to help you. This can help you solidify the concept in your mind. It's just looking at the types of various variables, homeostatic variables that are regulated here. All right, so for the next 35 minutes, I'm going to talk about calcium in the body. My personal inclination is to just plow through material, but I understand that we're all human. Does anybody need to use the restroom? Anyone want a break? Nope? Okay. Well, I'll keep going. Calcium. So I'm going to talk about calcium regulation, calcium homeostasis. I'm going to use the homeostatic control of calcium as a bit of a example. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail for calcium. And that's going to set us up for discussions about the skeletal system and the nervous system and a whole host of others, all right? So there's a little bit of a reason behind this. Calcium is so important. If I were to ask you what is calcium important for before I stuck this slide up here, I imagine the first thing that you all would have raised your hands and said was, well, calcium is what we use to make bones in our body, right? But there's a lot of other things, too. It is essential in neurotransmission. So the function of neurons is dependent upon having an adequate control over calcium in that neural tissue. Muscle contraction. So nerves and muscles are close cousins in some ways. They're both excitable tissues, and as such, dependent upon the electrolyte balance in them. Calcium is essential to muscle contraction. It's also required for exocytosis in other cells. So calcium is part of exocytosis in both muscle and nerve, but there are a lot of other cells that exocytose things. That is, have little vesicles or bubbles that merge with the surface of the cell and release their contents to the outside of the cell. It's called outside cytosis, outside the cell, releasing the contents of these little vesicles. This whole process, this fusion with the membrane, is mediated by calcium. So here is an SEM of some exocytosis. And then the whole clotting cascade is dependent upon the presence of calcium as well. All right. So there's a little over 1 kilogram of calcium in the average person's body. That's about 1.1 kilograms, about 2.3 pounds. The vast majority of that is in your skeleton. So your skeleton, although you may not look tremendously different than you did a year ago, over the past year, 18%, roughly 1/5 of the skeleton, your skeleton, was exchanged with the blood. That means about 1/5 of it was broken down and mobilized into the blood, and stuff from the blood was brought back and formed into the new skeleton. You're constantly remaking your skeleton, turning it over. So a lot of that is calcium that's getting liberated from the skeleton and then put back into the skeleton. Your plasma concentration is about 10 milligrams per deciliter. This is an important number for diagnostics, and presuming I get to the end of my slideshow, because I spent a little bit longer in the intro, you'll see why. Why was I emphasizing that? Well, about half of the plasma calcium concentration is just freely ionized, so calcium 2+, floating around in your blood, just by itself. And then about 44%, the other half, most of the rest of it, is complexed by proteins. Right? Proteins are either transporting it or folding around it in some cases as part of the protein structure. There can be protein transport, calcium transport proteins. All right. Functions of the skeleton. It looks like I'm going to test you here. What are some functions of the skeleton? Support. Let's see. Good. What else? Okay, protection. God, you guys are good. Storage. Calcium storage. Yeah, let's see if that one's the next one. Oh, movement. All right. Well, I bet you calcium storage is next. Electrolyte balance. That's basically that. Oh, man. Blood formation. Oops. Well, electrolyte balance is basically calcium storage. So, support, protection, movement, acid-base balance is part of it, all right? By the skeleton's role in electrolyte balance and controlling the buffering of the blood. And then, of course, the long bones are the site of red blood cell formation. All right. There are 6 types of bones. There are the long bones. These are the bones of the appendicular skeleton. Your skeleton basically breaks down into 2 broad categories. There's the axial skeleton. That's the bones that run right along the axis of the body. And then your appendages, your shoulder girdle and arms, and your pelvic girdle and legs. So the axial and the appendicular skeleton. The long bones are found in the appendicular skeleton, the humerus, the femur, bones like that. And there are the flat bones. Classic examples are found in the skull. These are the long, flat bones of the cranium. There are sutural bones. These are inconstant bones. So there's an interesting story about a sutural bone in one of the skulls that Colby College has that I'll tell you when we get into lab. It's a pretty crazy story, actually. But it's basically a bone that is not in every person, but it's a separate bone that is found in the suture between two other flat bones. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. Irregular bones, like the vertebra, they just don't fit into a good category because they're these weird shapes. Then there are short bones. Examples of the short bones are the carpal and tarsal bones, or metacarpal and carpal and tarsal. Pardon me. The short, small bones. And then finally, sesamoid bones. Sesamoid meaning like sesame seed, little bone. A sesamoid bone, for example, would be the pisiform. It's a bone that is contained within the tendon of a muscle. It's a bone contained within the tendon of a muscle. The breaking the name is the most prominent example. The patella, your kneecap, is a sesamoid bone that is contained in the tendon of the quadriceps that goes down to the tibia. Right? All right, so here is a picture of a long bone. This is some anatomy just so you can listen to me talk about the physiology. This is a living bone here, and there's the marrow cavity. There's this articular cartilage on either end where the bone articulates with another bone. And then there's this spongy bone where there's all these holes, and then there's a dense, compact bone of the shell. Right? So that's a very dense bone. This is spongy bone that's invested with a lot of other cells, the marrow, essentially. The structure of the bone is broken up into three parts. There's the diaphysis, which is the long length of the bone. And then there is the proximal and distal epiphysis. The epiphysis is the end of the bone where it articulates with something. You see here this epiphyseal line, and it's a thin sheet of compact bone that separates the epiphysis and the diaphysis. This is the so-called, does anyone know what the common term for that is?
The growth plate.
The growth plate, thank you. Yep, that's the growth plate. This is where the length of a bone is going to be growing in childhood and adolescence. So if you get a break along your epiphyseal line, you can have a shortened bone that doesn't fully develop if you get that injury as a child. All right. Here is the inner surface of a long bone. So we're taking a section of the bone. Here on the outside, we have this fibrous layer of tissue. Then there's the dense, compact bone of the circumferential lamella. We can learn about that in the anatomy class in the lab. Here on the inside of the bone, there's this endosteum. So on the outside, there's the periosteum. On the outside, on the inside, there's this endosteum. Endo meaning inside, osteum meaning bone. It's the epithelial cells on the inside of the bone cavity, endosteum. In this endosteal layer, we have a number of cell types. You're going to see them in a bit on the next slide or two. Osteoclasts, osteoblasts, and osteoprogenitor cells. And then inside the dense bone, we have osteocytes. Those are the four types of bone cells. Osteocyte, osteoprogenitor, osteoblast. All three of these cells share a common origin. All right, developmentally, they share a common origin. Its osteoprogenitor cells become osteoblasts, which then become osteocytes. Osteoclasts are a totally different type of bone cell, totally different type of bone cell. Multinucleate. Osteoclasts break down bones. They're related to what are called megakaryocytes, phagocytic cells that are going to break down bone tissue. Osteoblasts build up bone tissue. So having that equilibrium, that steady state, not equilibrium, pardon me, that steady state between that 18% of bone breakdown and bone buildup in a day is the balance between osteoclasts and osteoblasts. All right. So in flat bones, we don't call it a marrow cavity. We call it the diploe. We have two layers, flat layers of compact bone, and then in between is the spongy stuff, the diploe. Right, and that's where the marrow spaces are found. This structure enables the cranium to absorb a small amount of shock, not as much as the NFL would have you believe, but enough, some. So it's this compact, springy structure. All right, here we go. The 4 types of cells. I should reorganize these. I don't actually like the way they have this. The way they have this laid out. I would have these be number 1. Osteoprogenitor cells. These are the not fully differentiated cells. So when you're an embryo, a fertilized egg, we all came from a single cell, right? And that cell was totally undifferentiated, embryonic stem cell. And then it differentiates into different types, and it continues to differentiate. And there's this huge branching of cell types that happens as we go through differentiation. This progenitor cell is not fully, completely developed yet, right? It's a stem cell, and they come into action when you have some kind of stress on the bone, a break, or you're suddenly doing a lot of impact-bearing exercise or something like that. That's going to turn these bad boys on. They develop into osteoblasts. These are immature bone cells who are responsible for laying down the bone, helping to lay down the bone. They do not divide, they're non-mitotic, and they produce this osteocalcin that increases insulin production and increases insulin sensitivity in fat tissue. Right? They're responsible for laying down this osteoid, which is going to become matrix of the bone. The osteoid is like precursor bone tissue. Finally, there are these osteocytes. These osteoblasts eventually become osteocytes. They're mature bone cells that turn this osteoid into actual dense bone material, bone matrix. They are using calcium phosphate. They're responsible for calcium phosphate homeostasis, and they live in what are called these lacunae. These lacunae is a general term, just means a hole, a cave of some sort, a cavity. And they live in these osseous lacunae and send out all of these pseudopodia, these little legs. You can see the fingers that they extend out with which they use to modify the structure of bone. They repair any damage to bone. Finally, we have these osteoclasts. They're multinucleate cells, and they produce a bunch of acids and enzymes that are going to break down bone tissue. They're responsible for helping to remodel the bone. Okay. So, yeah, what's the take home here? There's a lot on this slide. Basically, remodeling results from combined action of bone dissolving osteoclasts and bone depositing osteoblasts. You have these stem cells that have a totally different embryologic cell type origin that come together, fuse, and then have this ruffled border that just eats into bone cell and breaks it down. Bone matrix. Approximately a third of the dry weight of bone is organic. That's made out of proteins like collagen, various glycoproteins, such as the glycosaminoglycans, the GAGs, the proteoglycans, whatever. So here is some collagen fiber. And then 2/3 of it is basically ceramic. It's inorganic, meaning most of it is, the 85% of it is this hydroxyapatite, this combination of calcium and phosphate into this complex structure. It's a ceramic. It's an inorganic ceramic that is invested with these proteins that give it the flexibility. So bone can actually bend a little bit, right? You can't take a ceramic dish and bend it at all, can you? But ceramic is pretty strong, okay? So this gives it some tensile strength. This gives it some rigidity, okay? There's this Haversian system. So bone has this complex set of tubes and holes and pathways that are running through it for the passage of blood. And nerves. One of the biggest misconceptions about bone is propagated by the idiom "dry as a bone." Okay, and that's because people see these dead bones that are all dried up and just the inorganic component left behind. Bones are richly invested with blood supply, with capillaries that run through this Haversian system. So in lab, we'll see this more. It's these sort of tubes of concentric lamella of bone matrix that have little arteries or capillaries running through them. Actually, veins, neurovascular bundles, nerve artery, or vein, artery, nerve that are running through these little tunnels. Okay. I'm going to skip that because there's some stuff I want to get to before the end. As I alluded to earlier, there's red marrow and yellow marrow. In child, it's all red marrow because they're growing and they need red blood cells to support a nitrogen-positive metabolism where they're building tissue. They need an ever-expanding amount of red blood cells. So pretty much a child's entire body is red. However, as you become an adult, the appendicular skeleton, the long bones, become yellow, which is basically fat stores. The marrow in your long bone becomes fat, and it's just a repository. However, you do maintain a little bit of red marrow in some of the flat bones of the pelvis, the cranium, as an adult. Okay, last night I decided to cut out a bunch of this, but there's a little bit. This is the only slide on development. So here is a definition, a distinction that I'm going to make for you. There's the distinction between calcification and ossification. Ossification, or osteogenesis, is the formation of bone tissue. calcification is simply the deposit of calcium into some sort of tissue. All right. So you can have calcium salt deposition in a tendon, and it can seem bone-like, but it is not truly a bone. All right. So there's calcification. Calcification is a normal process that is part of ossification as well. As you're building bone tissue, you're laying down matrix, you're building the collagen and the proteoglycans and the glycosaminoglycans, you're putting down this whole protein structure, and then you're going to build hydroxyapatite in this process of calcifying that organic substrate. So the osteoblasts, I told you, made the osteoid, which was that sort of almost like cartilaginous surface to the bone before it became dense bone. That is then calcified by the osteocytes in this process of calcification. All right? So calcification is a subset of ossification. There are two types of developmental bone formation. These are intramembranous ossification and endochondral ossification. Let's break the words down. Intra, inside membrane, membranous. So ossification. This is the formation of a bone inside of a membrane. What types of bones would you guess are subject to intramembranous ossification? Just thinking about the 6 types of bones I had, structures, what were the types of bones? There were long bones. What other types of bones were there? Flat bones. There were flat bones, exactly. So this would be a good candidate for flat bone formation, right? So you have a membrane initially in the early fetus. You have a membrane over the developing brain. That membrane goes through the process of intramembranous ossification. On the other hand, we have this endochondral ossification. That is what happens for long bones. So here we see the epiphysis. This is the diaphysis, the epiphyseal line, the marrow cavities. I cut out the slides that talk about that in detail. I used to go through it in detail, but oh gosh, here it is. No, this isn't. This is the end of that. We cut it out. So in a long bone, this endochondral ossification, there are two. There's a semantic distinction. There is this interstitial growth where you're going. This happens from childhood to adolescence, where the length of the bone is growing, right, at the growth plate, and then there's once that growth plate here fuses and turns into bone, you're like not growing bigger any longer, not taller at least. The bone gets thicker. The bone gets thicker. So this is probably happening to most of you now. Most of you have your epiphyseal plates are fusing. You guys are done growing taller, and the bones are simply going to be growing stouter, thicker with life. Okay, as you add weight onto those bones, it's just part of the natural process of development. So that happens by adding these what are called circumferential lamella, the layers along the outside of the bone. Go around the circumference. All right, hormonal control. All of this is controlled by the endocrine system, which maybe we'll talk about later in the semester. Here's a little bit of here's a list of all the hormones that are involved: the calcitriol, the growth hormone, various sex hormones, the parathyroid hormone, calcitonin. We'll talk about parathyroid hormone and calcitriol and calcitonin in a moment. Here is 2 different types of endocrine pathologies associated with bone growth. There's This is achondroplastic dwarfism. The long bones just stop growing. They kind of look like her face looks the same as the other person, and her torso does, but her axial skeleton just did not follow the rest of her body. All right, much more common. A much more uncommon one is this pituitary dwarfism. They don't have growth hormones. Their human growth hormone production is not what it should be. They look more or less normally proportioned. Their arms are the appropriate length compared to their torso and whatever. This is due to a dysfunction in the pituitary gland. All right. So in the last 10 minutes here, I'm going to go through calcium homeostasis. It's controlled by 3 hormones: calcitriol, calcitonin, and parathyroid hormone. And it's controlled in 3 tissues: bones, where the calcium is stored; the digestive tract, where calcium is absorbed from your diet; and the kidneys, where calcium is excreted. All right? So there's calcium coming into the body through the digestive tract, it's being stored in the bones, and it's being eliminated through the kidneys. All right? That should be pretty simple. And then these 3 hormones control that. Here, that's a schematic diagram. I'm going to go to a little bit better diagram. We'll start one at a time, going through the 3 hormones. Calcitonin. The job of calcitonin is to lower the plasma concentration of calcium. All right? So we have high levels of calcium in the blood. We want to drive those down. You can look at the thing if you want, but just using your critical thinking and knowing that it's regulated by absorption, excretion, and storage in the bones. What effect would you say calcitonin probably has on the kidneys? If it's going to lower calcium in the blood, what is it going to do to the kidneys? Is it going to slow the kidneys' elimination of calcium or speed up the calciums? Speed it up, right, okay. And then what about in the bone? Is it going to encourage calcium storage or inhibit calcium storage? Encourage, all right. So, in fact, it inhibits osteoclasts, which are the ones breaking bone down, and the osteoblasts continue to store the calcium. All right, parathyroid hormone. On the other hand, parathyroid hormone increases plasma calcium. Your plasma calcium is too low. Parathyroid hormone says, let's bring it up. So what is it going to do? What do you think it's going to do to your intestines? It wants to drive the calcium in the blood up. So what is it going to do to the food in your intestines? Pull more out of the food, right? It's going to increase absorption from the food. What do you think it's going to do to the kidneys? Is it going to increase excretion or decrease excretion? Decrease excretion. And what do you think parathyroid hormone is going to do to the bones? Is it going to stimulate osteoclasts or inhibit osteoclasts? Osteoclasts being the things that break bone down. Stimulate them. That's right. We're gonna actually break some bone down a little bit with parathyroid hormone. Yeah.
When the osteoclasts are stimulated, like breaking bone down, does that drive excess calcium into the bloodstream?
Yes. Yeah. So remember, the calcium is stored in the bone. When you break it down, that calcium has to go somewhere. It goes into the blood. Yeah. All right. parathyroid hormone works with calcitriol. They work together. All right. So calcitriol also raises plasma concentrations of blood. Calcitriol gets into your body one of two ways. Either this derivative of cholesterol that's in the skin gets hit by UV light, sun, gets converted to vitamin D3 in the skin, which gets sent to the liver, gets converted to calcidiol, and then the kidneys turn that into calcitriol. The specifics of all that are not important. And then calcitriol then has its effect on the intestines. It increases the absorption of calcium along with parathyroid hormone in the intestines. The other source of calcitriol is in the diet. We eat food that has vitamin D3 in it. Milk here in northern climates where people don't get as much exposure to the light is fortified with vitamin D, just to make sure that you have adequate dietary source of vitamin D. Okay, so here's sort of a synthesis slide. We have a calcium level. This is the range. This is the range that we want to keep. That we want to keep the calcium in the blood around between 9.2 and 10.4. Calcitriol has a weak effect along with parathyroid hormone, affects the reabsorption of calcium. Otherwise, it's being filtered by the kidneys. Calcitriol and parathyroid hormone is stimulating the liberation of calcium in the bone. On the other hand, calcitonin is inhibiting osteoclasts and driving the formation of hydroxyapatite by osteoblasts. Right, so here is probably a little bit better diagram. Here's the normal level. It's the same as the last slide. I was trying to find a slide that actually showed it well. So here is a normal level, about 10 milligrams per 100 milliliters of calcium in the blood. And if it goes up, if the calcium level in the blood goes up, the thyroid gland releases its calcitonin that affects the kidneys and bones, and it drops the calcium level down. However, if there's a falling calcium level in the blood, the parathyroid hormone turns on, affects the kidneys and bone, along with vitamin D, also affects the intestines, and it raises the calcium level in the blood. Okay, so that's probably the most elegant diagram I have. Yeah.
So if the calcium's
What-
taken up,
What's your name? When you guys ask me questions, tell me your name.
Tanner.
Tanner. Okay.
So if the calcium's taken up into the kidneys after the calcium tower, would that mean it's not the blood? So if it reduces it, then it'd be more in the blood. So why would the blood calcium decline?
Reduces calcium uptake in the kidneys. Yeah, that's probably. Let me make sure. Yeah, that's wrong. That should be increases. Good eye. Yeah, good eye. Wait a second.
Same with the bottom one as well.
Yeah, they're both off. I want to make sure that that's actually a typo. Huh. Yeah, I think that's a systematic typo throughout that. That's what I get for not really reading the slide. Thank you. Yeah, that should be reversed. I'll fix that later. All right. Estrogen.
estrogen is one of the hormones that is responsible for maintaining bone density in both men and women. It inhibits resorption by osteoclasts. Estrogen turns down the sort of modulates, attenuates the action of osteoclasts. So when women reach menopause and their estrogen levels go down, osteoclasts become a little bit more active than they were during the other parts of their life, and it can lead to this osteoporosis, the development of osteopenia, which is pitting of the bone, or actual osteoporosis. There's a number of techniques for dealing with it. Estrogen replacement therapy that can slow it down. These drugs that destroy osteoclasts have a lot of problems with them, but none of these are that ideal. Parathyroid hormone can also slow down if you get it daily, but it has effects on other parts of the body. The best is prevention. So as 20-year-olds, I don't know how old you are, probably about 20, right now is the right time to start eating right and exercising. So setting a solid foundation early in life is the best way of preventing problems later in life. Eating a balanced diet that has appropriate levels of absorbable calcium in it, and getting good aerobic, moderate load-bearing exercise early on is a good way to prevent these problems from later in life. You don't want it. Here's spinal osteoporosis. So here's normal bone, here's normal spine bone, and here is osteoporotic bone. It doesn't look like it would take too much to bust that vertebra right there. All right, here's a different image of that. Leads a normal woman's posture to this kyphotic posture that I'm sure you're all very familiar with in old people that you've encountered in your life. All right, so I'm pretty much at the end of my time. This is where I was going to get on a soapbox and talk about exercise and nutrition. I'll skip all of that. I've already talked about nutrition a little bit today. This is interesting, though. Your circulating level of calcium can be an important diagnostic tool. So here is a scale of plasma concentration of calcium. And here's that normal range right around 10 that we talked about. Okay? And if you chart that on this scale with the circulating concentration of parathyroid hormone, if you see where a patient's parathyroid hormone is in relationship to their calcium, it can be diagnostic of a whole host of pathologies. All right, so hypoparathyroidism can have low parathyroid hormone and low circulating calcium. Hypercalcemia due to cancer of some sort, like some sort of malignant tumor, can lead to high calcium but low parathyroid hormone. And then hyperparathyroidism, which we will talk about in the endocrine chapter, Graves' disease, is going to give you high parathyroid, high calcium. Renal failure is going to give you high parathyroid with potentially normal calcium levels. So there's a lot of diagnostic use to measuring circulating calcium. All right, the last of these is just I like to do a little bit of pathology at the end. Fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva. Has anybody heard of this one before? Has anyone heard of the elephant man? That's the story. I forget the man's name, actually. It's an autosomal dominant allele on this chromosome indicated there, the 23rd or second chromosome, that leads to ossification of tissue that is not meant to be bone tissue. So their muscle tissue, actually, the like tendons, the connective tissue in their muscles, become ossified, and their skeleton becomes really malformed. So here is an example of a woman. Interestingly, their diaphragm, their tongue, and their extraocular muscles are the only muscles in their body that are actually spared. So they are able to breathe and move their eyes and swallow relatively normally. But here is this woman, and then here's or man, I don't know who that is, but and then their skeleton after death. You can see what it did to that person. Really unusual, pretty horrifying disease. Okay, so